Good evening. Welcome to my webinar, What is Food? I'm excited that you're here. I think this is an interesting topic because we have forgotten. We really have forgotten what food is with all the developments with food over time. And so I am interested to dive into this topic with you, and I appreciate you being here. I did read Michael Pollan's book, In Defense of Food, and that sparked a lot of this talk, making me do some research and just remembering some things that I learned along the way, and way back in grad school, and most recently in my nutrition training through Institute of Integrative Nutrition. So I'm combining all that information for this webinar. Michael Pollan sums up how to eat in 3 statements. He says, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And that's pretty much what we're going to talk about tonight, that we can return back to traditional way of eating, simplify eating. We've made it really, really complicated unnecessarily. So sometimes I can feel frustrated that we've really messed up our food system. How did we mess it up so badly? However, there's hope. So all hope is not lost. And we definitely want to be focused on things we can change and things we can grow on. But before we talk about all positive things moving forward, let's just give a little bit of background of some history of food in our country here. We, alarmingly, 4 out of the top 10 leading causes of death are chronic diseases that are very much food related. They're 100% preventable. So diabetes, stroke, cancer, and heart disease. These chronic diseases are as a result of our processing of our foods, our industrializing of our food. And it's interesting to think, we eat a lot of sugar, we eat a lot of fat, we eat a lot of wheat, corn, and soy, but we eat very few vegetables, we eat very few fruits, and we are eating less and less whole grains. So let's talk about this confusion of, well, how do I eat? How am I supposed to eat? And how did this get so messed up? There's a term that Michael Pollan uses in his book called nutritionalism. And at first that kind of sounds like a good, strong educational word. But actually it is not. It's the idea that our food is made up of a bunch of different components, and that the components can be broken down. And when we, for example, see that a banana has potassium, well, then let's just add potassium to a substandard food, and it's just as good as a banana now because it has added potassium. And this breaking down of food into fats, carbohydrates, and just breaking down it into vitamins and specific vitamins and the quote nutrients in the food, and making the assumption that the sum of the parts equal the whole. And that's just not what we're seeing at all. So people have gotten awards for discovering, protein, fats, carbohydrates, and discovering how to break down all these nutrients. But the reality is, when we think about food as broken down nutrients that can just be subtracted and added to our diet, I know, there's some controversy about taking vitamins. My personal opinion on vitamins is that our soil is so poor that our food's just not as nutrient dense as it once was. So taking vitamins sometimes is necessary. And honestly, for most of us, it's a good idea to at least take a basic vitamin. So I take doTERRA's Lifelong Vitality vitamins, knowing that I'm getting a great support underlying. The, um, the scientists have further confused the issue on food because they try to do studies. They do studies on what foods make people well, what foods make people sick, what are the best foods for people to eat, what's the best diet for people to have. And the reality is that there isn't a best. We make these general food claims, and fat is bad for you, so therefore eat margarine is an example of a scientific food claim. We're going to remove all fat from your diet. And so now we've introduced a fake fat into our diets, which of course, 30 years later, we know we're all fatter and sicker because we all listened to the advice. We are bio-individual, and what Michael Pollan found in his book, and what I've learned elsewhere, is that there are hundreds of different cultures with hundreds of different varieties of diets. And as long as the people eat the food that's native to their culture and that's a whole food, they can thrive on food from, eating tons of fish up in the northern, what is now Canada, to eating a tropical diet with a lot of fruits and vegetables, or root vegetable diet in Africa, that there are different diets everywhere, and the actual amount of fat, carbohydrates, and proteins in those diets vary quite a lot. There's not an ideal amount for each one, but the factor that is the same is that they are all eating whole foods. So that's the important part. This idea that we can just fortify foods and make them healthy for us is not working. So the science is in now, the data's in. We are not healthier because we've been doing this. And a lot of other, another factor is these food pyramids that have come out over the years. And the food pyramids, unfortunately, are being influenced by the meat and dairy associations and so forth. And the science, when you look at the food pyramid that I grew up with, there's white bread, white rice, a big push on carbohydrates. And we know now that those foods are not good for you. They make us fat. They don't turn off our natural signal in our body to tell us we're full. So we end up eating way more than we need to when we focus on a high carbohydrate diet. And there was no distinguishing between a complex carbohydrate versus a simple carbohydrate. And that's a big mistake. So we've just gotten fatter, we've gotten more unhealthy over time. What about the government? Shouldn't the government be protecting us? And the answer is, well, they're not. So we really need to do our own research. It used to be necessary that any food that wasn't a real food had to have a label on it called an imitation label. And with all this nutritionalism and feeling like we can break down the parts are as good as a whole, what the Food and Drug Administration changed in 1973 is that as long as the parts add up to the nutritional value of the whole, then you don't have to write imitation on there. So what we ended up with is, and what we have today, is a bunch of processed food that's been fortified with vitamins, roughly the equivalent amount of vitamins that you might find in its whole food equivalent. And we're not having to label it as artificial, and so now we think maybe it's food. When you go in a grocery store and you shop the perimeter of the store, there are foods. There are things like chicken. Okay, I see chicken. There are produce. Okay, I know what an orange is. An orange comes from a tree. I know what it is. There are nuts. Okay, I know a nut is a food. But when you start to shop in the inside of a grocery store, you have a plethora of foods that have been dreamed up by some manufacturer and fortified with vitamins. And the truth of the matter is, if your food has a food label on it that's making a health claim, then you probably want to avoid it, because it's basically saying this is crap. This is junk food that we've just added nutrients to. And okay, you might have some vitamin A in there. It might be roughly the equivalent of the vitamin A in this over here. But what we're totally discounting is that you're getting all these chemicals and junk preservatives, and that when vitamins are separated from their true food source, they're not bioavailable to us. Our body doesn't even know how to utilize it efficiently. And so it can have a amount of vitamins on the label, but that doesn't mean that's the amount of vitamins your body's actually taking in. And that's a real problem, because we've been kind of deceived that thinking that what we're eating is healthy when it's actually not. All right. So the FDA is not really helping us. They've created just a lot of confusion over what food is and what foods are good to eat and what aren't. And we've switched over to eating 70% of most Americans eat 70% processed foods. And most of our foods are soy, corn, and wheat. And any processed food, you're going to look on there, it's going to have soy, almost 100%. So we're getting a lot of seeds in our diet, but we're not getting a lot of leaves in our diet, like greens and leafy cabbages and kale and spinach and all that kind of stuff. So that is definitely a switch we can make for ourselves when we think about what is food. Going back to Michael Pollan's idea of, well, what do we do? Well, we eat food, right? Not processed stuff. We eat not too much food, and mostly plants. So that's going to be our focus here. So what does eating food, not too much, mostly plants look like? When we eat food, we need to consider our own heritage and our own background and what's natural to us. And we need to think through what foods our body needs, and which might be different from someone else. And we don't think this way. We have kind of accepted this USDA statement for every individual, and we know that that's not true, that we need to figure out how our bodies need to eat. Some of the things that you can be doing is you can stop eating processed foods. So you can shop the perimeter of the store, you can read labels, and you can just say, no, I'm not going to eat that. Now, it's very misleading, because a lot of gluten-free, even vegan foods, they're labeled. And so we think they're good for us. But if it's processed, it's still processed, whether it's gluten-free or vegan. So we want to be careful that we're eating real food. Instead of eating sweet potato chips, we need to eat the sweet potato, right? So that's what we mean by eating food. Okay. So eating whole foods instead of the refined food version of the food. We need to start thinking about returning nutrients to our soil. This is a really big deal. The way we've have this monoculture food production system, we are stripping our soil of nutrients, and we're over harvesting. We're planting the same crops, or we're planting the same 3 or 4 crops that are removing nutrients from the soil, and they're not being replenished. So what big problem in agriculture for the United States is that we have focused so much on the quantity of the food and a lot less on the quality of the food. So when we make this shift in our mind to eat food, not too much, mostly plants, when we make that shift, we need to realize that if we choose quality food, we actually need to eat a lot less. And part of that is because when you eat food that's substandard, that our body can't really utilize the nutrients because they're not bioavailable to us, when you eat those foods, it's not meeting the nutritional needs. And so our body is telling us to eat more. And so we end up eating way more than our body needs because our bodies are smart and they're trying to, eke out some nutrition from the substandard food source. When you eat whole foods, on the other hand, our body fills up and our body gets this nutrition that it needs. Now we might have a mindset shift where we think we're not full because it's a smaller plate, and there is a process of sort of recovering from this overeating syndrome in America that we have that you may need to work through. But in general, our bodies are satisfied and satiated when we eat whole foods. Okay, so replenishing our soil. Eating organic is not, the solution, only the solution, and it's not perfect, but it is a big improvement to eating conventionally where they're not adding back into the soil. With the organic label, they do need to be adding back into the soil. There's practices that are happening there that are just better for producing a higher quality produce and vegetables, but they're not necessarily producing the numbers. And so that's one of the reasons why organic foods are more expensive. And I think it's worth it. So focusing on food quality and not food quantity, eating more leaves, green leafy vegetables, and fewer seeds, the wheat, corn, and soy. We need to recreate the food culture that eating is about community. It's about connecting. It's about our heritage. It's a beautiful thing. Eating is amazing. And what we've done is we've created this confusion around food, and we're running around like crazy that instead of food bringing us together, it feels like, and I'm guilty of this sometimes, it feels like, why do we have to eat again? I have teenagers right now, and I do sometimes wonder, really? You have to eat again? Okay, I got to make something, for you to eat again. And instead of seeing the process of making food is beautiful and about community and the variety of food and the color and the smells and the senses, cooking used to be this beautiful thing that happened in our families and in our communities. We'll let the fire truck go by here. But now it's become a rush, crazy ordeal that's no fun, and we're lacking that sense of fulfillment that food used to give us. And so I want to claim that again. I want food to be joy and not just, stuffing our face. So when you choose really good quality food and you're cooking it with love, it's a big deal when you sit down and you're in conversation and you're chewing your food and you're experiencing the smells and the sensations. That's what we're going for. We want to eat and enjoy and be thankful and all that good stuff. Okay. Just a couple other little tips here is if there are a lot of food, a lot of ingredients in what you're eating, it's not a whole food, right? If there's unpronounceable things, bread only has 4 ingredients. So I would consider bread a food. Now, whether you're gluten-free or not, that's a whole nother issue. But if you try crackers, and crackers have 19 ingredients and a bunch of them you can't pronounce, I would avoid that, right? And Michael Pollan even goes to the extent of saying if any food has a food label that is trying to say it's nutritious, flee, just don't eat it. It's based on bad science, and it's basically a clue to us that that's a substandard food. If at all possible, joining a food co-op or even having a garden in your own space or a community garden is a great way to connect us to the food and just really appreciate the food again, but also make sure that we're not getting all those extra added chemicals in our food. So in summary, we talked about how eating the Western diet is making us sick. We've talked about how nutritionism, the breaking apart of nutrients and then adding it to these manufactured foods is not the same as eating the fruit or vegetable itself. We've talked about how the food scientists have made all these claims about food and they kind of change over time, and it's kind of designed like we try to keep having these new ideas about food because, oh, here's another thing I can market to the American people, when all we need to do is eat the food, right? Eat food that's actually whole and that we see it and we know what it is and it doesn't have all these crazy ingredients in it. We've talked about how there are many cultures around the world that eat their native diet and are very healthy. There's no ideal way to eat, but while we can fit in, you can find all these different ideal or these diets that work for different cultures, the one diet that we have found that doesn't work for any culture is ours, is a standard American diet. And so we don't want to eat like that. We need to learn how to return back to thinking about food differently, enjoying our food, embracing the goodness of food, not thinking about food as an inconvenience, and we purposely buy in bulk because it's all about the quantity of the food and not the quality of the food. We want to switch our mindset and return back to the idea that it is about the quality of the food, the experience of eating, and it might take a little bit more time in our life to have good food in our life, and that's okay. So I'm on this journey with you. I am constantly trying to improve my own eating. I want to feel great. I want to age well. And I want to encourage you to come alongside me and eat food, not too much, right? Not too much food. We just need what our body needs, and mostly plants. So thank you for watching my webinar, and I will see you soon. I'll be back with more topics in the future.